Tarnished Ones, Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree, the long-awaited DLC arrives on June 21st. And after much waiting, content creators and media across the world got to play the game for the first time. My name is Kodiak, this is Legacy Gaming, and here's 5 things you need to know about FromSoft's upcoming DLC. One question you might have leading up to the release of the DLC is, how do I jump into the new Shadow of the Erdtree content? Is my character strong enough to take on all the new challenges? And where do I even access all of that content? All of those questions were seemingly answered at the hands-on event, and I think we have a good barometer for what players need to prepare for ahead of launch. So, to level set, during the hands-on event, players were given level 150 characters. More than one creator made it clear that FromSoft said that 150 wasn't a requirement, but it puts players in a comfortable spot to be successful. Now, if you're anything like me, you like a little cushion, especially in a Souls game, so try and hit that 150 mark, maybe even a bit higher. Keep in mind there are still some fantastic farm spots out there that you can hit up ahead of launch, and now, right now, is the time to get your character to where it needs to be. As far as where the DLC kicks off, well, that's been widely speculated, but now we know for sure. Players will need to make their way to Mohgwyn Palace and defeat Mohg to gain access to the Land of Shadows via the Egg of Miquella. There are only 2 ways to gain access to Mohgwyn Palace. The first requires you to access the Gateway Teleporter in the frozen west of the consecrated snowfield. This is only activated once you defeat the Sanguine Noble that invades nearby. The second way to reach the palace is by obtaining the Pure Blood Knight's medal from White Mask Vare, who you meet within the first hour of the game. I won't go into all the details on that quest here, as there are plenty of videos out there already breaking down the quest. Once you reach Mohgwyn Palace and defeat the boss Mohg, you'll be ready for the transition into the Shadow of the Erdtree content. At this point, FromSoft has also confirmed that you don't need to beat the base game story to access the DLC content, but you do have to defeat General Radahn as well as Mohg before you can access the Land of Shadows. One question we always have as players going into a DLC is, how big is the experience? We're spending more money on a game, and the simple truth is, we want to make sure we're not wasting our investment with just a few more hours of content. I don't think anyone ever truly believed that would be the case here, but let's talk scale for just a minute. One thing that was consistent across almost everyone's first impressions that went hands-on was just how impressive the scale of the DLC content is. Just like the first time you ascend the elevator and look out into Limgrave, that same sense of scale greets players as you enter the Land of Shadows. We can see that with our own 2 eyes throughout the B-roll. We are still small within the world, and because the art team are masters at creating that sense of vertical scale, we feel like a speck within a massive open world. The idea of trying to recreate a grand experience once again is present in the first Legacy dungeon, Bellerat, which multiple outlets reported was somewhere between the size of Stormvale Castle and Castle Morn. As expected, Bellerat is jam-packed with new enemies to fight, such as scorpions, guards, gravebirds, and armored knights. The second dungeon preview players had access to was Castle Ensis. This was more reminiscent of Caria Manor, with a heavy emphasis on magic-wielding enemies, and the dungeon included encounters with giant Carian armor sets. Outside of dungeons, players can expect more caves, crypts, and optional content, and by all accounts, these should feel very familiar if you explored side content in the base game. One slightly disappointing account from the preview was that there are some repeat and reskinned enemies within the DLC. Not only are they copy-pasted, but they're actually clones from the base game. Now, this isn't a huge deal, but given that the team has had 2 years to work on the DLC, you would think they'd want to avoid using old assets. Even still, that's a small thing to nitpick at this point. Clever and simple, that's almost a FromSoft hallmark at this point. And one thing we learned about the new DLC is how player progression will keep pace with the Shadow of the Erdtree content. It's actually rather brilliant. There are new items called Scatatree Fragments, and these can be turned in for Scatatree Blessings. Each blessing you receive gives you a permanent increase to your attack power and defense. This is a system alongside the traditional leveling, so now you're keeping pace in 2 ways from a purely power perspective. On top of that, there are Revered Spirit Ashes, which function almost the same way. By turning these items in, your Spirit Ashes receive a permanent buff to their attack and defense. The kicker here is that these turn-ins also increase Torrent's defense, so even if you don't use Spirit Ashes, it's worth tapping into this system to buff your horse. We also learned that these 2 power progression systems are only active in the DLC content, so If you return to the base game for whatever reason, you won't all of a sudden massively overpower that content. Like I said, it's a brilliant and simple way to deal with two distinctly different parts of Elden Ring without outright disrupting one or the other. If there's one thing we all love about FromSoft games, it's the weapon variety, and Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree is set to add 8 new weapon types into the game. Creators and press went hands-on with every new weapon, and while footage of each new weapon type wasn't provided as part of the supplied B-roll, it was pretty clear based on everyone's account that the new weapon types are fun to use and impactful in combat. The new weapon types are great katanas, hand-to-hand darts, thrusting shields, reverse hand swords, perfume bottles, light greatswords, beast claws, and throwing weapons. Weapon types are a category of weapons, so expect to see multiple individual items that fit within those 8 new weapon types I just listed. We got a really great look at 4 of the weapon types, and I wanted to share just a few thoughts on each. The light greatsword might be a type of weapon I never knew I wanted. I always loved the idea of bigger swords, but not the clunkiness that went with them. I've just never been in that camp. I like the finesse of combat, not the chunkiness of it. The light greatsword seems to straddle that line between elegance and lethality, and that's something I just never considered. According to reports after the preview session, the light greatsword is a weapon that actually taps into a variety of combo attacks. It functions almost like a slashing rapier, and the ability to chain together moves makes it feel satisfying to use. Another new weapon type, the hand-to-hand darts, was very popular amongst the preview players. This is definitely newer territory for FromSoft, and that's a good thing. We should want companies, even the best within the industry, to continually challenge themselves with new and innovative ideas. Now, if you want to square up with enemies in the Land of Shadows, you can do that, punching, kicking, and jumping your way to glory. In a similar vein, but definitely more dramatic, are the beast claws, which are fist weapons you wear on your hands and give you an almost primal moveset. Again, from the footage we've seen, this looks similar to the hand-to-hand arts gameplay, but only if you crank up the chaos to 11. Just like variations between different types of swords, I think there's going to be nuance here as well, and it's something I'm really excited to test out for myself. Finally, there's the perfume bottles, which I am surprisingly excited for. Just like the enemies we faced in the base game, players will now have the ability to throw perfume bottles that explode, dealing elemental damage to enemies. There's no ammunition or FP cost for using this weapon, and because it functions like a primary weapon, you have all the variants of light and heavy attacks, including charged attacks that are really quite a spectacle of explosions. I've got a sneaking suspicion someone's going to find a way to break the game and make these absolutely bonkers in a build, and quite frankly, I'm here for that. The other weapons, we're just going to have to wait and see for ourselves. We got glimpses of things like the throwing weapons and thrusting shields, but nothing more than a few isolated clips, which really don't give us the full picture. We had to end on a high note. The thing that makes FromSoft games so memorable for players: boss fights. Preview players couldn't stop talking about the Divine Beast Dancing Lion, which was the end boss of the Bellerot dungeon. There's plenty of footage to analyze, but one thing that immediately stands out to me is how fluid and frantic the boss's movements are all at the same time. The encounter, as you no doubt can tell, is based on the Chinese dragon dance, where multiple people drape a costume over themselves and move as one to create the illusion of a massive mythical creature. That's what's happening here, but this is FromSoft we're talking about, so you have to take things up to 11 at all times. The boss clearly strikes with a ton of agility, and that might actually hamper a lot of players that rely on slower, more methodical weapons. Every player that took on this boss also pointed out Phase 2, which alternated between ice and lightning power-ups, which force you to deal with random lightning strikes or massive AoE ice attacks. Keep in mind, this is all while avoiding its main abilities. Another boss that players had access to was R'hllana, and while the name is ironic to say the least, the fight itself seems to be no joke. Sadly, no one was allowed to share footage of this fight, but we do have some intel on the fight mechanics. R'hllana is a humanoid enemy, only slightly bigger than the player. She uses a combination of powerful melee attacks and magical attacks, and in her second phase, her two swords become imbued with either red or blue magic, giving them different functionality. However, the hallmark of her fight is a full moon attack, which calls down a massive moon that slams into the ground, reverberating out a shockwave that practically one-shots players from full health. I think it's safe to say we should be expecting some pretty epic new encounters. And again, I do want to point out that some reused bosses were found in the preview, so not everything we fight will be a new experience, but hopefully these new dungeon end bosses will drown out the memories of having to face yet another ulcerated tree spirit. So there you have it, important new details about Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree that you need to know about. The DLC arrives on June 21st with preload happening on June 19th. We'll be diving in on day 1, and this time around expect a lot from the Legacy team. We took a crack at Elden Ring during the initial launch, but a lot has changed since then, so keep an eye out on the channel if you're looking for a different voice in the sea of Souls creators. My name is Kodiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.